Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this month's University of Wisconsin Division of Extension's Badger Dairy Insight. The Badger Dairy Insight is a monthly webinar series that we offer on the third Tuesday of each month, and it provides the latest research-based information to improve dairy animal welfare, breeding and genetic selection, automation and modernization, and decisions for producers, dairy workers, managers, and agricultural professionals. My name is Caitlin Goldsmith. I'm a statewide dairy outreach specialist with UW-Madison Extension, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We hope to provide this opportunity as an informal discussion on today's topic. This is a webinar format, so please add any questions or comments in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And this webinar is also being recorded, so you can find it on our dairy website in about 1 to 2 weeks, and we will also feature it in our monthly dairy e-newsletter. Our webinar today is titled Drone Tools for Dairy, From Research to Real-World Use. To kick off our webinar, we will have Dr. Neslie Agdenitz presenting. Neslie is an assistant professor and extension specialist in biological systems engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And her presentation portion will be entitled UAV-based air emission measurements from pasture-based livestock systems. We will then have Dr. Gustavo Monzon, a former postdoc at UW-Madison and currently a technical services nutritionist with Exacta Animal Health, presenting Ready for Takeoff, a bird's eye view of practical drone applications in dairy farming. Dr. Victor Cabrera will not be able to join us today. He has some travel that he's working through right now. So with those introductions out of the way, I will hand it off to Neslie to begin her portion.
Thank you, Kathleen, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm Neslie Agdenitz. I'm an assistant professor and an extension specialist in biological systems engineering. So we got hit with hail last week. I hope everyone is safe. I hope everyone made it through safely. So this morning I saw one of my neighbor was checking his roof using a drone. So it links to today's topic. So we are not using drones just to check our roof anymore. There is more to it, and we are going to dive into how we use drone in agricultural operations. So my topic is about air emissions, how we monitored air emissions using a drone from different pasture-based livestock systems. All right, so before we start, I prepared the slides so we are in compliance with all regulatory requirements. So we have a remote pilot license, which is required by the Federal Aviation Administration. So you will see some slides on this presentation. So this study was conducted before December 22nd of last year. So after this date, there are some restrictions on using foreign-based drones. So now I am in the process of purchasing another drone. So for some studies, not all of them, for federal funded studies, I will not be able to use the drone I'm showing you today. Also, all farms were visited with the consent of the owners. We didn't just, flew our drone on people's farm. We asked, we agreed, and then we did this research based on the concept. All right. So there was a research gap. So before we started the study, when I searched literature, most of the air emission data from pastures, they are model-based estimates. So there is a lot of data in the literature. People quantified air emissions coming out of pastures, but they are not direct measurements. So they are model-based estimates. And there are a couple of studies. They are limited to dynamic flux chamber measurements. So we can use a dynamic flux chamber. So you see a dynamic flux chamber in this picture. We can use a dynamic flux chamber, but the number of samples we can collect on one specific day will be very limited. So you can have like 3, 4, 5, 10 dynamic flux chambers, and this will be the number of data points you have for your sampling depth. So we used this drone system, and the goal was to scan the whole surface of the pasture. So if there is any variation in data in emission rates, to be able to capture those differences. So I think our shared goal with farmers who participated in this study is improving sustainability, right? We do not want to lose, if we are applying any nitrogen, we do not want to lose that nitrogen in the air. So we want to improve sustainability of our farm operation. Also, unlocking any financial incentives. So an example is the Dane County's continuous cover program. So if you decide, I'm not saying we should do that, but sometimes people prefer to do it. If you decide to convert your continuous crop, for example, cornfield to a pasture, then there are some incentives available. So some people, they are trying to scale down or they are getting ready for retirement, then this is an option. There are these kind of programs. So if we are able to provide any data, any background information, if we can help farmers in any way, that was the purpose of this study. Okay, so what you're seeing here is our flying air analyzer. It has a fancy name. We call it flying air analyzer. So you see a drone and you see that black box under the drone. It is our air analyzer. So it's a portable air analyzer somehow attached to the drone. And what you're seeing is a long stick, which is our sampling probe. And then you see at the end of the sampling probe, we have the wind sensor. So we use this sampling probe, I will show you in a minute, to avoid downwash to affect our sampling, especially when we are recording the wind speed. We don't want it to be affected by the propeller downwash, or when we are, recording our air emissions, we don't want it to be affected by the propeller downwash. So this is how it looks like when we open that black box. So it is a very light air analyzer, but there is a lot inside. It's very compact. So once we open it, we are having difficult time to put it together. So we have this data acquisition system. So it records data, whatever it measures in the air, and sends it to the cloud server. We have many sensors, so we use, like here you see VOC, methane, NO2, H2S, ammonia, CO2. We have PM sensors. We were able to measure PM1, particulate matter, PM2.5, PM10. There's an air pump, so this is actively pulling air through that sampling probe. And then what you're seeing is the flex foil air sampling bag. So if you look at C, picture C, the number 9, so that's aluminum foil color bag is the flex foil air sampling bag. So we had two options when we were sampling. We were able to do continuous sampling using these sensors since we had this air pump, so that air pump was pulling air through our sampling probe. We were also able to say, okay, now stop doing continuous sampling, start filling up this airbag. And then sometimes we filled up our airbag and then brought it back to the lab. So it was our quality control. So whenever we did sampling, so we also did the airbag sampling, so that we had a chance to bring it back and analyze the airbag using our conventional GC method. So we were able to compare our data. Okay, so this is the picture we created to show how we overcome this propeller downwash problem. So this is called 88 centimeter. I didn't know why it is 88 centimeter, why not 100, but there's a logic there. So if you're holding it upwind, so it depends on the drone you are using. Each drone's propeller downwash effect might be different. But for the specific brand we use, that 88 centimeter sampling probe was sufficient enough to avoid the downwash. So when it is heading to upwind, as you can see, this pink smoke represents the air emissions coming from soil, coming from pasture, right? So when it hits to the air sampling probe, and then wind sensor is also at the end, at the tip of that probe, they are not, sampling is not affected by the propeller downwash. If it is a little bit shorter, then the propeller downwash would have affected our sampling. All right, so we used the flight planning app. Many different apps are available out there. We used one of them, and then by using this app, we were able to sample the same locations whenever we visited a farm. So we did it like we checked the wind direction, so our sampling probe was always heading upwind. And then we also used this app so that we did a little bit more systematic study. And then we use this DRIMS2 data mapping software. So what this software does is, one, it shows all the measurements when we are collecting samples. So we had a tablet, and then we were able to check what data points we are getting. Also, this software save data and send it to the cloud. So when we came back to the lab, we were able to look at the data. It was already saved there. So each flight, it depends on how long we fly, but over 70 measurements per parameter per flight. So we were able to scan the whole surface. So sometimes we were able to fly more than once, and then we did the sampling for a couple of days, not just one day. Okay, so here we see the quality control. So two quality control methods we used. One, as I mentioned earlier, we used the small air sampling bag attached to the drone, and then we collected samples inside that one, and we brought it back to the lab, and then we analyzed it using our GC. So this is one. The other one, the quality control method we used is the dynamic flux chamber. So this is a traditional method we always use. So we use that one to collect samples and then to compare to the drone samples. So we use ArcGIS Pro to prepare our maps. So here you see the bluish colors, they are low emission, cold colors mean low emission. And we see the red, orange, yellow, they are high emissions. So there was a variability in air emissions. So even if it is a 2-acre pasture, air emissions varied a lot since it depends on where the animals were located. And then they were a little bit like a microclimate, even inside that pasture, we were able to capture that one. So this is collected our samples from 5 sites. So 2 dairy sites, 2 beef sites, and 1 sheep site. And then it was kind of challenging to find 2 beef sites that are similar to each other or 2 dairy sites that are similar to each other. I think what we tried to do is we tried to match the stocking densities. Even if the stocking density was not identical, they were kind of close to each other. 2 beef sites had the similar stocking density, 2 dairy sites, they had the similar stocking density. And the sheep side stocking density was a little bit different since it was kind of difficult to find a sheep site. We used this our Arlington research station. And then all had cool season grasses with less than 30% legume. And each site visited 5 times during the regular grazing season. All right, so here we see the results. So CO2 concentrations measured using RGC, and which is the gold standard method, very traditional, very, very reliable method. And we see the CO2 concentrations measured using our UAV system. So there was a high correlation. So kind of like when we compared data, we saw that it did match maybe not perfect, but it was very close. So it only overestimated 9.7 ppm, but we are talking about 550, 600 ppm level. So the data was acceptable level. All right, so let's have a look at a couple of slides here. So summarizing the CO2 and NH3 results. Uh, First of all, emission rates were from pastures, from any of the pasture, dairy, beef, or sheep, they were not high. They were slightly over the ambient level. So when we look at the CO2, there was a significant difference between the animal species. So dairy was significantly higher than beef, and beef was significantly higher than sheep. In general, dairy had the highest emission rates as expected, since dairy is a different type of animal species, right? This is what was expected. And the hardest part was to find the correct unit to report the air emissions. So in the literature, air emissions are reported in different units. And if enough information is not provided, it's very difficult to compare the air emission you came up with to the data reported in the literature. For this study, we decided to report it per meter square and per day. And then somehow it matched to the data reported in the literature, so in the same order of magnitudes for CO2. For NH3, it was in the same order of magnitude with the data reported in the literature. We had the kind of interaction between the species and um, I think the interaction is between the species and the sampling days. So it is the precipitation that site received on that specific day. So data is kind of all over the place. It doesn't follow a good order. So we had the dairy one side, it had the highest NH3 emissions, and then beef one, and then beef two, and then sheep, and then dairy two. So due to the interaction, data was affected. All right, particular matter. So PM1, we always hear about PM2.5 and PM10. PM1 is kind of like all those small particles. I think we are the first one who reported PM1 emissions coming out of pastures or any livestock system. So again, the order was different. So dairy 1, beef 1, dairy 2, beef 2, sheep. So for PM2.5, the important finding was rainfall significantly affected PM2.5 emissions. So rainfall reduced PM2.5 emissions by half. So it was important to know. And PM10, again, interesting, rainfall didn't affect PM10 emissions. So the rainfall affected those small particles, but it didn't affect those bigger particles like PM10 particles. So, but what affected PM10 was the forage density. So dairy 2 side had low forage density. So it was an organic farm. So no fertilizer was used on that site. So forage density was lower compared to the other farms. So it had the highest PM10 emissions. So hydrogen sulfide, again, data was all over the place, but in the same order of magnitude with the data reported in the literature. And again, there is an interaction was found between species and rainfall, just like ammonia emissions. So we had the dairy one. So dairy is usually the highest, dairy one, beef one, and dairy two is an organic farm. So lower emissions from always from dairy two and beef two. And sheep as it had the lowest stocking density. So the lowest emissions came out from the sheep side. Okay, so when we look at the NO2 and nitrous oxides emissions, So they are very associated with the soil nitrate levels and rainfall events. So we know very well that N2O is related to rainfall event, right? So again, data is all over the place, but there one was highest and then ship was the lowest. So this increased water field pore space affected N2O emissions. So after a rainfall event, N2O emissions went up. So higher vegetative cover showed reduced N2O emissions. So when the stocking density was low, N2O emissions were low. The higher vegetative cover, if the pasture had the cover, then they were able to utilize the nitrogen and it was not emitted as N2O. So when the vegetative cover was high, N2O, both NO2 and N2O emissions were low. And then these are the kind of conclusions. So a lot of statistical analysis, a lot of analysis. There are so many parameters affecting emissions when we visit a farm. So one is the rainfall event, forage density, and then the wind speed, temperature, animal species, that rotational grazing, where we collect samples. So it is very difficult to have like generalize the data. So what in these kind of studies, not in this study, in these kind of studies, what we see is data is all over the place. But there were a couple of things that constantly kept coming up. One is the with precipitation, when soil was wet, we had higher NO2, N2O, H2S, and VOC emissions. So H2S and VOCs, they are mostly anaerobic gases. So we were expecting that one. We were also expecting higher N2O emissions, since to be able to generate N2O, we need to have both the aerobic and anaerobic process. So precipitation helped to reduce PM2.5 emissions, but it didn't affect PM10. And the low forage density. So if we don't maintain our pastures, so there is a balance there, right? So if we apply fertilizer, we have higher NH3 emissions, maybe we have higher NO2 emissions, but if we don't apply fertilizer, then if we have low forage density when we don't apply fertilizer, we have increased CO2, ammonia, NTO, and PM10. Since the forage doesn't use nitrogen, so it is emitted or it is lost to the air. And we published two papers based on these studies. One was kind of method development paper, how we developed this method, what are the quality control parameters we followed when we were using our drone-based system. The other one was much more like reporting the emission rates coming out from dairy, beef, and sheep pastures. The study we did was not enough. So we had only 2 dairy pastures, 2 beef pastures, and only 1 sheep pasture. So it was not enough. We need more data, and we need to find that unit that we all agree to report, so that when we publish a study, we are able to make some comparisons. So if we always choose to report in different units, then we will not have enough background information in this area. So we are grateful for the funding provided by the Wisconsin Fertilizer Research Council. They don't always, fund corn studies. They also fund pasture studies, and we are grateful for their contribution. So I have little QR codes on the slide. If you want to scan those QR codes and read more about these papers, you're welcome to do it, or you can always email me. So my email address is easy. Nestle@wisc.edu. And that's all I have for today. And I want to save some time for the next presentation.
Thank you, Nestle. Well, great presentation. So while I switch here, let's just make sure everybody can see my screen okay. can hear me. Thanks, Nestle, for the confirmation. So today, Nestle was presenting a little bit about the use of drones to monitor more of the pasture, the gases, and we, like in the animal science department, we try to use it to generate useful information that will help us manage animals, right? But where is all of this coming from? I think it all starts with the current scenario of the US dairy industry, right? We have an increase on the average herd size in the US. At the same time, we have a short of labor that we're observing. So with that, we see more and more farmers trying to adopt technologies. So we call them precision livestock farming, precision dairy technologies, which is pretty much the use of real-time monitoring technologies that can collect data on the individual level. So we need to identify who that animal is and know what they're doing over time. And just looking at the on the left graph here on the number of publications, especially after the 2010s, we've had a great spike on research on their precision livestock farmer. And I think one of the normal things that we see is a lot of the use of accelerometers, sometimes microphones to monitor animals. And especially on the last, let's say, less than 10 years, we see more and more the use of cameras. And this is what the normal technologies that we're used to look like, right? We're gonna have milk meters, automated milking systems, automated calf feeding systems. We have some cameras that can do body condition, measure behavior of the animal. We have a whole sort of wearables from collars, rumen boluses, leg tags or pedometers. There's so many of them. And we did a survey in Wisconsin, that we sent a survey out through the whole United States, and we had 81 respondents with farm sizes that ranged from 15 to 9,000 cows. And what we saw is just more than 80% of the survey respondents, they adopted the technology. And within those technologies, we saw that we have highly adoption of wearables. So a lot of those pedometers, collars, and whatnot in the US. But even on cameras, we see a 10% in cameras. And one of the technologies that we're discussing today, even on this webinar, are drones. And a lot of them, Nestle was showing, they have the capability of doing air samples, and pretty much all of them are equipped with some sort of camera. So there is this survey about the use of drones in dairy farming and other technologies as well. The survey was conducted by the International Farm Comparison Network. They gathered 45 respondents, and most of them were still industry allies, so vets, nutritionists, consultants. But one thing that was reported is that around 16% of those surveyed farms or people, they adopted drones on their day-to-day work. And of course, there's a lot of use for drones in agriculture. We have, especially on the crop side, there's so many use of drones for spraying, surveying as well. So they didn't disclose how those drones were being used, if it was for animal monitoring, if it was more on the crop side, but it's still very interesting to see that 16% of the people that responded to the survey are using drones on a daily basis at their farms. But I think the main question is, why do we use drones? Why use drones if we have all these sorts of technologies there that a lot of them still need a lot of development and they're not fully perfected yet? So why we're trying to come with something new? And I think one of the main questions and the main answer is we can monitor our cattle in a large scale and in remote areas, right? I was hiking a couple years ago and I put this picture on purpose, and you see the heifers are still pretty far. Do you think that those animals are monitored often? Do you think the farmer knows how many there are in the pasture? If none went missing? If they're gaining weight? Do you know where they're eating, where they're staying? So the use of drones allows us to pretty quickly go and take a look at those animals and monitor them as well. And it's even there's this quote from Fortune Business Insight saying that by 2030 the drone industry will be at 18 billion. And if I'm not mistaken, the new number projected for 2032 is already more than 30 billion dollars industry. So there's a lot of possibility, there's a lot of money involved, and there's a lot of possible applications. But when we talk about drones and animals, I think the first question that we have is how do the animals respond to the drone? Are they scared of the drone? Are they gonna freak out or really doesn't bother them at all? So this is some research from researchers in Asia. What they did, they had 30 cows in a grazing setting. And then they flew the drone for consecutive days, like starting at 10 meters, so like a little bit more than 30 feet, up to kind of 10 feet height over time. And what they were trying to do is get this drone to zigzag, and they were trying to herd the animals with the drone. And at the same time, they were recording the behavior. If the animal did not respond to the drone, if the animal stopped grazing, or if the animal even appeared startled. So, which is a great show of even like that fight or flight response, right? The animal is running away, so it feels threatened by the drone. And one thing that is very interesting, on the first day of the study, they did see a high startle rate, around 20% of the animals. But as the study progressed during this 10-day period, they saw that on average, just 5% of the behavior observations were associated with startling. So showing that the animals, they get less scared, they get used to it, which is even interesting. That shows that on here they were trying to herd the animals. So they were trying to use the drone to move the animals across the paddock, and even trying to simulate sometimes what those virtual fencing systems do, that is guide the animals towards like a more lush part of the pasture or move them towards the parlor, let's say. And that was effective pretty much for the first 3 to 5 days. And then after that, you can see that like the orange bars that represent the successful herdings where the animals they were able to move the group of animals, it decreases. So showing that the animals already don't see the drone anymore or as a threat, or even like as a human was handling them. So interesting to see that we can use it to observe the animals, but we might not be able to use it to herd them. I think another very interesting study is from like the animal well-being group from the University of Calgary, from Dr. Maria Ceballos. What they did, they used 69 calves, and they were using these drones to get really close to them. Even like the recordings that they did in this study, they were higher than this, but what they did was a 5-day adaptation period where they started with the drone high, and then they would move the drone and look at the response of the animals. If the animals didn't respond, they would lower the drone. If the animals stopped responding, they would start moving the drone, and then progressively up to the 5-day um, habituation period. And what they saw, they used these drones to take pictures of the calves. So they were taking pictures of the faces of the calves so they could use it for a grimace scale. So a grimace scale is a pain scale or a reaction scale, and they were using it to evaluate pain after castration. So if the animal had a tilt to the ear or had squinting in the eyes, they were able to use the animals to monitor those calves. So those calves got used to it, and it was a very successful approach. But even in these two examples that I showed you, all this data collection and all the evaluation was done manually. So, what we are trying to do at UW is we're trying to integrate computer vision systems with these drones. So, computer vision systems, they are artificial intelligence systems that pretty much they're going to describe the world through images. They're going to process the images, they're going to interpret it, and they're going to start extract some properties of them. So, and that takes a lot of computing power and a lot of training. Like from now on, I'm not gonna bother you a lot of how we trained the type of artificial intelligence models that we use. I think like the focus here today is to show a little bit more of like the applications and not the whole process. But it is a process that takes a lot of images, a lot of times to train the computer to be able to analyze these images, and a lot of time to get the computer to get the data that was extracted from the images into something useful. So one of the things that we like to highlight, for example, one of the trials that we did, and very similar to what Nestle had said, like all these trials, they were conducted before we had changes in regulations in the use of drones, and they were all flown by the same conductor that was approved as well. So if we think on like calf raising facilities, already like more than 60% of the calves in the US are raised individually, and 10% of this whole calf herd is raised in calf rearing facility. And if we start thinking about like the increase in farm size, pretty much half of the farms that have 500 or more cows, they're gonna have calves raised in a system like this, where they send off the calf to a calf grower, and these calves are gonna be either sent back to the farm after weaning or even when they're pregnant close to calving. So one of the challenges is if it's already hard to monitor animals on a smaller scale and check them every day, how do you monitor these animals in a scale like this? So the study that we did was we went to a commercial calf raising facility, and then we got a section that is represented here on the bottom left. And this section housed approximately 800 calves. So we flew a drone at 60 feet high for 6 days. So we flew the drone from 7:30 a.m. to around 4:30 p.m. So this study was conducted in the fall where the sun sets early, and we did it 5-minute intervals. So overall, we collected almost 60,000 images just from flying the drone every day within this area here. And all the images, they looked a little bit of what you see here on the right. We have the hutches. We're going to have calves that are inside, calves that are outside. So one thing that we did, we trained the artificial intelligence model to detect these calves if they were inside or if they were outside the hutch. So especially thinking about other technologies like accelerometers, there's plenty of research showing that there are shifts in the activity patterns of the animal associated with the onset of disease. So I think one of the first objectives of this was, can we use these drone images to monitor how the calves are behaving? So what we see here on the right is pretty much the output of the model, the artificial intelligence model that we saw. So the green boxes, they're going to show calves that are outside of the hutch, and the blue boxes, they show calves that are inside of the hutch. So as the calf moves in and out, we have recording of the animals in and out. Here on the left, we have this graph here, and this graph is on the herd level. So we talked about the use of technologies for the individual level and individual identification of the calf. On this herd level, we were able to pinpoint if the calf was inside or outside of the hutch with approximately 83% accuracy. So pretty accurate considering that we have something that's flying in the sky at 60 feet high and moving at the same time. So if we even look at the distribution patterns of the calves here on the left graph, so the green line, we're going to have the percentage of the calves that were outside of the hutch at any given time of the day. And even here on the dotted line, we have the ambient temperature. So we can see this relationship between ambient temperature and calf activity. And I think more importantly, it's very interesting to see that we have a great proportion of the calves outside around feeding time. So the calves, they start coming outside even before feeding, right? They're anticipating, they're hungry, they know what's happening next. So even looking at this in the group level can help you understand how the farm is being managed. Is the grain being delivered at the correct time? Is the milk feedings happening at the correct time? What is happening to the calves? Or is it getting too cold that the calves don't come outside enough anymore? And we need to do some sort of management to get these calves to come up and eat more often. So even this data on the group level has the potential as well to help farmers. But of course, um, if we're able to detect this calf on an individual level, we're able to monitor it closely, which is the next step of this study. And we're working as well on that data. And as of now, we're able to identify the individual calf with approximately 70% accuracy. So we can monitor its behavior. We can know with pretty acceptable accuracy which calf is which and how they're doing every day. So that allows us to track their behaviors and know how they're deviating. I think another application of drones, it's a very low-hanging fruit, is the use of drones on grazing systems. There is even data showing that more than half of the world is grazed. And of course, like we have all this relationship when we're trying to manage grazing systems that we're trying to manage the pasture that is a living thing. We're trying to manage the animals that are living as well. And it's a very complex relationship on managing the pasture, how the pasture is doing dictates what the animals are going to eat, and it's going to dictate their performance as well. So if we have a pasture that it's not doing very well, we're going to have animals that are grazing a lot of fiber. They're going to have fill. They're not going to have high performance. So this is some studies that I'm going to present next that were conducted by Dr. Guilherme Menezes. He's a postdoctoral research associate in the Digital Livestock Lab working with Dr. Joan Doria. So what he did is he visited 11 farms in Wisconsin, and he programmed the drone to cover 1 hectare area, which is approximately 2.5 acres. The drone was also set to fly at 60 feet. And what they also did, they did a forage mass collection of those. They did some grazing simulation. So within one of those grids, they would come and simulate a cow grazing. And they also took soil samples as well. And what he did was he was using the camera on the drone. The camera on this drone that he used is able to detect the spectrum that is not visible light. So we get a little bit of near infrared spectrum. We call it the multispectral camera on the drone. So what it was doing is calculating some vegetation indexes based on these colors that were in the pixels of the images. And it was using that vegetational index to predict the composition of the pasture. So what Dr. Menezes' results show is that by using the drone and the images from the drone, they were able to predict with pretty good accuracy the fiber content, both on like ADF and ADF of of the pasture, uh, pretty accurately as well, the protein content and even like the energy content of the pasture. But when they started looking at a little bit of like the leaf biomass or the pasture biomass, there are some interactions there with the fiber, but still with 70% accuracy, this is something very interesting. Like we can use those numbers not to know accurately how much there is on the pasture, but we can use the trends to make decisions. Is it time to move the animal? Should I fertilize this pasture a little bit heavier because I know that's not going to be ready by the time that my heifers come back to graze? So, using these types of cameras to predict pasture composition seems a very interesting and feasible idea too. But as I was saying, the pasture by itself, it's nothing. So when we're doing a dairy study, we have to have the animals in it and have that kind of complex relationship because we're trying to manage the pasture, we're trying to manage the animals. So that was Dr. Menezes' next step. With animals in the pasture, he wanted to have the image from the drone, as we see here on the left side, and he wanted to be able to detect the cows and then looked at these cows closer with a couple image processing steps to be able to use some AI models to first identify the animal, so who the animal was, and also what the animal was doing, if the animal was standing or if the animal was lying. So starting with the animal detection, like at first we were talking about counting animals in the pasture. So yeah, with 97% accuracy, we were able to tell that there were cows. So we were pretty accurate at counting the cows. And the same thing happened with the posture of the animal and even the individual identification that in this case was done just based on the colors and the markings of the animals. So even what we see here is like some masks. We take the animal out and we have that outline of the animal. And from that, we can detect the widths of that animal. We can detect some key points on bone structures. And we can use all of this information extracted from the pictures to try to predict weight. So this is what Dr. Menezes did. And even in these grazing heifers, he was able to predict with close to 90% accuracy the body weight of these animals. So it's a very interesting way to use the drones to track the animals, know how much they are, what they're doing throughout the day, and at the same time, like understand how much weight they're gaining. So you get more and more information to manage your pasture system more accurately. So I think this brings us to the conclusions and like next steps of this drone research that's currently being done at the university is, well, we see that the combination of drones and the cameras that they have with these computer vision systems, they show us like a very feasible way to monitor the animals in commercial and even large scale settings. But there's still like some opportunities to further develop these systems to be able to track the animal health and performance. And also, we need there's opportunity to integrate, as we look here in the bottom, like some of the regular camera, the RGB camera data with multispectral camera data to look at the pasture in different ways and try to really get this complex interaction between what the animals are doing, where they're eating, what they're eating, and what's the composition of the pasture. So there's the opportunity to increase a little bit the complexity of these models so they can bring farmers with better information to make management decisions. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for the opportunity of presenting. And I believe that Nestle and I have time to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. So if anybody has questions, they are welcome to put them in the Q&A section of this. I do have some questions for both Nestle and Gustavo. And the first one, and it's for both of you, is how did you account for things like wind conditions, temperature, even precipitation like rain? I don't think you guys did anything in the winter, but snow, things like that that would affect how these drones operate or the measurements you were getting.
So thank you, Caitlin. I was hoping you would ask this question. So yes, the advantage of the study we did the study during the grazing period, right? From early June, late May to September, late September, early October. So we were advantageous, right? We didn't do our studies in winter, much more like during the warm season. But yes, wind speed, temperature, even barometric pressure, they all change, right? So one thing we tried to do is we tried not to fly our drone during very windy days due to safety concerns. So we handpicked those days, the wind speed was less than 5 meters per second. Another thing, when we are doing our calculations, right, I didn't report any concentrations. So I reported emission rates. And when we are calculating emission rates, we did record temperature, barometric pressure. So we used the PV and RT formula and we standardized our emission rates. So we did take them into account.
And yeah, I think adding to Nestle, one thing that we did, yes, that is one of the big limitations of the use of drones. I think the weather in general. We try normally to mimic autonomous flight. So we program a route so the drone can fly but supervised. And normally the drone will adjust its speed according to the wind, but of course, excessive wind, those are no flight conditions. And even on the calf monitoring study, we did have like a couple days with precipitation where we were not able to record, I think both for safety and for quality reasons as well. So those would be days that we're not going to be able to monitor your animals.
Perfect. Thank you. And then the other question is, both of you kind of touched on it, but what are like the next steps? Are we going to be expanding and doing this on more farms, testing out some different things? Just kind of a quick overview of where you see this going.
Yeah, thank you for that question too, Kathleen. So what we did in the studies, we measured air emissions coming out pastures. And what we found is air emissions coming out pastures are not very high, right? Just slightly over the atmospheric level, which we expected, right? And then I think the next step is to compare these air emissions to the air emissions coming from cornfields. So, and then how they are comparable if we are thinking about that continuous cover crop program, if there are farmers who are planning to scale down and convert their cornfields into a pasture. I mean, it's not for everyone. I'm just saying it for people who would like to scale down or who are planning to retire. So then we need to have that comparable data, right? So the next step is to quantify air emissions coming from corn pits.
Yeah, I think like on the animal level, especially these trials that we do, we collect a lot of data. We do like a very thorough approach when we go to farms. Even the pasture collection one, they looked at the soil, they looked at soil nematodes as well. So there's like a lot of data to come from that. On the calf side, we were able to track the behavior of the calves if they were like inside or outside, so more the position of the calf. And I think a couple next steps. Well, first, try to associate that with health outcomes, try to predict disease based on the farm records, and associate that to the behavior of the animals. And there's even opportunity to record other behaviors. Like, for example, a lot of farms have the water and the grain buckets outside of the farm. So train new models that, for example, if the calf is outside, can we detect if it's eating or drinking water and try to add more variables? So I think there's like a lot of opportunities to, well, increase the complexity of these models still and to increase the level of information that we deliver to farmers.
Very cool. A question that came in specifically for Nestle is, in your study, did you measure methane? And then also, would it be possible to analyze these gases inside of dairy cattle barns?
Yes, I didn't show data for methane. It was one of the slides that was hidden. And I'm caught, right? Yes, we do have data for methane too. Yes, and dairy has more methane emissions than beef and sheep. So as we know, right? So can we use the same air analyzer to collect to do measurements inside a dairy building? Yes, right, we can. And then we did a study in summer in Arlington Research Station. So and then we use the same air analyzer, so it will record the data for a period of time, and you have that continuous data. But can we fly a small drone inside a dairy building? That is kind of risky. So we are remote pilots. We have the skills. We have certain amount of flight time experience, but it is kind of difficult. Probably it wouldn't be allowed to fly a small drone inside a dairy facility. But what we can do is we can fly it around the building, right? And then capture the emissions that are coming out of the building. That is possible. Mhm.
Perfect. Okay, I think that's all of the questions we've had. If you have any follow-up questions after today, you can always reach out to either presenter. They both shared their information on their slides. You can also join us next month on May 19th. We're going to welcome Dr. Laura Solano. She's assistant professor at the UW-Madison School of Vet Medicine. And Dr. Solano is going to share some firsthand insights from dairy managers, employees, and veterinarians across Wisconsin as they discuss the workplace dynamics shaping today's dairy farms. So whether you're looking to strengthen team relationships, boost productivity, improve herd outcomes, this session offers fresh perspectives and actionable takeaways tailored to today's dairy operations. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our website to register. The next slide, please, Gustavo.
Trying.
Oh no.
There it is.
You can find those links there on either under the Badger Dairy Insight, that'll take you straight there, or just on our website in general. And we will have this recording up on our website in about 2 weeks. So for any additional information or unbiased university-backed resources, you can visit our website on the web, or you can find us on Facebook at Extension Agriculture. And with that, we will close out today's webinar. Thank you for everybody for joining us today.